You are still suffering in pain, still ripped to bits and raggedy, already toughing and untame. You have stood tall for liberty. Your mother's milk was anger. Now you will get no peace from it. It will keep growing, 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 till the prison doors at last go down. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to talk about a Ukrainian poet named Vasyl. He did get a good education, but he did start working a normal blue-collar work. He shared his name to me, and then he shared a few of his poems. His poems are quite interesting, but with more research I found out that what Vasyl actually represents is much more than just poetry. It is the spirit of Ukraine. Vasyl was born in 1938 in Ukraine, during the time when the Soviet Union had control over it. Vasyl always had an interest in writing poetry. It was something he would do throughout his life, no matter the circumstances, and when he couldn't, he would protest and do whatever he could to be able to write again. But it all really started with one protest letter. Letter of Protest 139. Just want to quickly add something before we continue. Dobrovolsky is in this letter. Not, he didn't sign it, this was afterwards, but his name is in this letter. Yes, our boy, Alexei Dobrovolsky, the crazy neo-pagan, because of the Trial of the Four. They mention the Trial of the Four in the letter as an example of the USSR using unfair trials against dissidents. So everything is connected. Yeah? Stus is connected to my other videos through Dobrovolsky. The meaning of this letter was to complain to the Soviets that human rights were being trampled upon. People were taken away without due process, and a lot of people who were just a tiny bit critical was removed. In particular, it was about a woman in Alla Gorskaya. Alla was also a political dissident, as many people were, but part of an intelligentsia that was a bit critical. Did art and poetry, and the rest was critical about the Soviet regime. And during this time, anything that was deemed as sort of nationalistic, and Ukraine has a history of wanting to be different. This is something that the KGB and the Soviets wanted to stop, because it was seen as bad. It could create problems. It's better to be united through one nation than to have a different identity. So a lot of the people in Ukraine who were much more focused on the Ukrainian language and sort of moving away from the Russian ways of things were removed. You know, this later becomes a big part why Ukraine became so distinctly different in many ways to Russian, which then created the conflicts we have today, where Russians still think that Ukrainians are part of them, they are the same people. But in actuality, because of actions like this, then a nationalism that has created in Ukraine, because of how the Russians sort of tried to move them away from being independent, well, independent in national identity, they became extremely focused on national identity later on. Anyways, they removed any part of the intelligentsia of Ukraine. The letter writes, "We are writing to you on a matter of deep concern to various circles of the Soviet public. Over the past few years, political trials have been carried out in the Soviet Union against young people from among the creative and scientific intelligentsia. We are concerned about these processes for a number of reasons. First of all, we cannot be concerned that many of these trials violate the laws of our country. For example, all the trials in Kiev, Lviv, and in Vino-Frankivsk in 1965 and 1966, in which more than 20 people were convicted or held behind closed doors, contrary to what is directly and unequivocally guaranteed by the Constitution of the USSR, the Constitution of the Union Republics and their criminal codes. Moreover, the close nature of the trials contributed to the violation of the laws in the very course of the trials. We believe in the violation of the principle of publicity of legal proceedings runs counter to the decision of the 20th and 22nd Party Congress on the restoration of socialist legality, runs counter to the interests of the Soviet society, is a discretion of the supreme law of our country. The Constitution of the Soviet Socialist Republic and cannot be justified by anything. This goes on for a bit, and I will read the ending as well here, otherwise this will go on for a bit too long. We consider it our duty to express our deep concern of what is happening. We call on you to use your authority and your power to ensure the organs of the judiciary and the prosecutor's office strictly observe Soviet laws, and that the difficulties and disagreement that arise in our social and political life are resolved in the ideological sphere and not given to the competence of the organs of the judiciary office and state security. This is meaning the KGB. Hopefully that gives you a bit of an example. And Vasyl was one of the people who wrote under this. He was, as you can understand, worried that the KGB and other people that are not part of the laws of the nation took away people because they deemed them, risk of revolt. And the consequences of this letter was anyone who wrote into it was deemed a terrorist. Yeah, so Vasyl was taken away and arrested. Throughout his life he would be arrested twice. The first one is for signing the letter, which anything he then built up was then destroyed. His doctrines was destroyed, his poems were destroyed, anything he worked on was destroyed, because he was deemed as a terrorist for the Soviet people. I should point out that the destruction in poetry was actually happening before the letter. He was protesting way before this happened in 1965. The letter was written in 1968. But it was with writing that letter, it was deemed as much more of a threat. So in 1970 he was arrested. But his poetry has been destroyed before, and was destroyed multiple times. He was not allowed to write what he was writing. But it was mostly the targeting of him and the others that made him write the letter, and that will later put him in jail. So he was taken to jail in 1972, and he had a 5 years sentence. So he would be released in 1977. But something happened during the first sentences that would actually matter a lot in the second sentencing. So in 1975, the real problem started to occur. He's been in prison now for a little while. They tried to re-educate him. That was the point of him being in prison as well, to re-educate him, to not make him write Ukrainian poetry once he's gone. So he was actually put in prison for 5 years and then exiled 2 years. And they didn't want him to write more once he's out, and especially when he's in exile. But during the re-education, his stomach started acting up, and this is the real jux of things here. So his stomach started acting up, which means he couldn't actually eat the diet or the food that was given to him in prison, the normal rationing. He required special food. So they started giving him special food. This is usually hot food. He couldn't eat cold food, he needed hot food. They gave it for 4 months, but then stopped. And then he had 2 months without it, which was just too much for him. At this point, he was in such agony, in such pain, that he either had to go back to the food or not. He was sent to a place where he was confined still, but in a better location where he can have other types of food, but still under surveillance. And there he could actually start writing again, which he did. He started writing when he was gone there, which was seen, well, not as very positive. But while he was out, they also gave him an operation. So they gave him an operation for his stomach, and they thought, well, once him being out and having an operation, he should be able to come back again. And he did. And at this point, he had written 300 poems. And they found out about him writing the poems, and they destroyed the poems. So in 1976, he was back. He was back in a camp where he actually also started writing poems. And throughout his prison, they said he wrote up to 600 or maybe even 800 poems. When he was back, and after some time, his stomach started acting up, and they weren't giving him his special diet. So instead of eating the cold food, he decided to hunger strike. And after 4 days, they gave him his hot food again. But he noticed that might be a really good idea to do hunger strikes, because I got what I wanted. So he did a hunger strike again. And this time he had 3 things he wanted to be done. 1, the return of his poetry and translations. 2, the opportunity to write. And 3, the removal of the restriction of his correspondences. This obviously did not occur. But he tried for a long time, but didn't work out. But he got sent back home in 1977. He couldn't do it forever, obviously, but they didn't give him really what he wanted, but they gave him some stuff, obviously. And then when he was in exile, he began writing again, writing even more, and then being very angry at it, taking whatever they could, destroying whatever they could. But this couldn't last forever either. So in 1980, they wanted to fully set a stop of his writing. They had enough of it. A stranger lives my life and wears my body. He spends my years on earth instead of me. I have no eyes and ears, no mouth, no hands and feet. I am estranged inside my body and a lump of pain. I hover, shut in self in total darkness. At birth, your psyche ends up stark naked. You fail to grasp together with your body. You did not manage to attain your flesh. A passerby who transits interworlds, you stir, forgotten, at the very bottom of someone else's self. 100 nights awaits you, and 100 nights have died. You hover in between, a voiceless doll, white hot from self-inflicted scorching pain, a speck of hell, the universe scream, laconic and intense, devoid of exits, a shotgun pellet of the sun. You roamed and lost your bearings in this forgotten body. You're still waiting for your birth. However, death entered your existence long ago. So they did a trial. And oh boy. From 29th of December to the 2nd of October 1980, the Kiev City Court had a case on a member of the Ukrainian Helsinki group, we'll talk about this very soon, who was charged under Article 62, Part 2 of the USSR Criminal Code, Article 70 of the RSFSR Code. We're back to trials, boys. Hope you're ready for another trial. What happened here, Stus didn't just write poems, he actually started to complain about human rights violation, and he joined something called the Helsinki Group. The Helsinki Group still exists in Ukraine today. So what the Helsinki Group was focused was on the Helsinki Accords, and was mostly the parts of human rights in the Helsinki Accords that they wanted to focus on. And especially Article 19, which states everyone has a right to freedom of opinion and expression. The trial is quite long, so I won't go into all of it. But what they wanted to get out of it is that Stus was sort of a nationalist terrorist for Ukraine, willing to do harm to the well-being of the USSR. So they needed to find evidence that he was a nationalist. And they couldn't find it. They tried to do this by destroying his character. This was the character assassination. So before the trial happened, they were in different places. They were in his friends' houses. They were like looking for any sort of evidence that Stus was positive in a way towards Ukraine that is not about the humanitarianism of the Helsinki Accord. They did find a letter that Stus wrote in 1977 when he was in exile. In the letter, he wrote that he wished to join the Ukrainian Helsinki Group. And he wrote, "Urge people not to fear a tank, though it might mercilessly crush every living thing in its path." The defendant for Stus pointed out the profound humanitarianism and democracy in his views, and that superficial nationalism was totally alien to him. If one understands nationalism in the sense that one cannot love mankind without first loving one's own mother, however, then that is true of Stus. He was painfully aware of all the evils of the nation's life and spoke against them plainly and sharply. There's a back and forth between the witness and Stus. Stus asks, does the witness know that the Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, includes the right to hold one's own views? The witness says yes. Stus continues, what about the inviolability of private correspondence? The witness says yes. Stus continues, does the witness know that during the pre-trial investigation on 8th of August, I was subject to physical torture? He did it. Stus pointed at the deputy head of the KGB's investigations prison, standing by the door. The witness says, I did not know that, but if Stus says so, then it's true. Stus was asked if he thinks that this trial is legal. He says, I do not. The witness says, in that case, I refuse to take part in the trial. The court gave Stus the maximum sentence, 10 years strict regiment camp and 5 in exile. In addition, the judge imposed in Stus' court cost of 2,300 rubles. The judge read out the verdict, mumbling so quickly that neither dates nor names of witnesses could be heard distinctly. After he finished reading, he said without a pause, the trial is over, and the special public headed for the doors. You murderers! You didn't even let me make a final speech, cried Stus and quoted Lermontov. And all your black blood will never wash away the poet's righteous blood. Stus looked very ill. His face was deathly pale. During a visit from his wife after the trial, he said he would never survive such a sentence. And she was correct. From what he learned the first time, he did hunger strikes, and sadly this time he was not healthy enough, and he died during one of his hunger strikes. So finally, I'm just going to talk about the Ukrainian Helsinki group. They're still active till this day. They still focus on human rights, and now, especially with the war, they focus on any breaking of human rights, or the Helsinki Accord done during the war. So they are an observation group. There's been many members in Ukraine that's been a big part of this. Many who were dissidents in Ukraine were a big part of the Helsinki group. And there are quite a lot of interesting figures one can talk about in quite detail, but we will stop for now. There is more studying I need to do with the Helsinki group to fully understand and explain it to you, so I will stop until I make a fool out of myself even more. So anyways, thank you, and we will talk more about different Ukrainians, hopefully this week. I have some more planned. But take care, and goodbye.